So over the next 25 minutes, what I'm going to do is say why. Why are people doing this? Why are people bothering to think about retaining knowledge, capturing and retaining knowledge? What are these things called critical knowledge assets? You heard from Dr. Peter earlier on about a process he uses, but actually that process has to produce something that's of value. And at the end, it's what every organisation has in the way of the assets it has. And how to measure, how do you measure? How do you assess the risk? And I'm going to share with you some examples at the end from accountancy, health and the nuclear industry. Because there is another way of looking at this thing called knowledge. Okay, just to situate this, if you, and I apologize, I'm expecting my colleagues to read this way, but that's unfair. But if you look at that, that's effectively what today's commercial reality is. All of you have heard over the morning a number of those ideas being espoused. A declining return on assets and relentless pressure on costs. Every organisation is trying to drive down cost. Certainly much shorter product and service life cycles. Short cycle product based working. People now do things in chunks. I come from a software background as well, where if you didn't get something out the door within a few months, you were toast. Global supply chains. One of the earlier speakers referred to the way that the US and the plane manufacturers look across the world. I mean, there's a company that I think there's a Chinese company, the biggest company you've never heard of, called Li and Feng, I think they are, who produce goods for the American market for something called the Avenue or something like that. Anyway, and they guarantee within 30 days of getting an order, an idea, they'll have it on the shop floor in America. Certainly increased partnering relationships. That means that a global business now has to deal across global partners. We talked about higher levels of complexity, and certainly this is one of the things that I think underpins this theme, a gradual transformation of the workforce from industrial to knowledge-based. In the Middle East you have a particular issue, and that's the temperature. And you also have the WTO in the background saying if you provide finance and support to subsidise your industry to do blue collar work, you're in trouble. So that's one of the big challenges you have that others don't. And this is a big thing here. And this is what drives, in a way, the work that we're doing with the British government at the moment around downsizing, outsourcing. And in their case, actually, it's also about flexible working. These two pictures both tell stories. I'm going to share a little bit of both of them with you. The young lady on the left is Chinese. She was a young professional at the Asian Development Bank in Manila. Their issue as a bank was they've been going for 40 years. How could they transfer some of the knowledge from those 40 years back to people like her who were walking in the door? And actually, what were they interested in? One of the problems that knowledge management has very often is that the people like me who help other people say, well, this is the sort of things you need. We actually asked a whole range of different people, if you could know one thing when you walked into your business, what would it be? And we got them to write in a very big atrium, little cards, and put them across the timeline. And gradually they built up an understanding of the sort of questions that they would actually like asked when we got around to doing what we called oral history interviews. The second one is from a document produced in Barbados by the Caribbean Development Bank. They are effectively the World Bank for the Caribbean, and they have a very interesting role because their economic support is around policy-based lending. But one of the challenges they have, like a lot of development institutions, is that everything they do is a long way down the line. That report was produced 2 years after the funding of a school in St. Lucia. And what they discovered was, when they'd done the feasibility study, nobody had actually thought, one of the great things about living in or one of the bad things about living in a fairly poor country is that people can't actually afford transport. So what was happening, they had this shiny, gleaming new school with no students because no one could afford to get there. So instead of actually thinking about buying a bus or something, they didn't. And this was one of the lessons. Now, the point at issue here is that was 2 years after. It could have been 2 months after. And so they had to change the way they thought about the knowledge transfer process, the knowledge exchange process, and bringing it, using knowledge management tools, bringing that to be much more current. Here's some other examples I alluded to earlier on. This is why people think seriously about whether they want to start capturing knowledge and retaining it. In the nuclear industry, there is a huge issue. Sellafield in the UK, you may know, Sellafield in the UK are decommissioning their plants. But this is a 120-year program. It's not something that's going to happen overnight. The other problem is a lot of people who were in Sellafield when it started have been there 30, 40 years and are retiring. So they had that huge issue. The other challenge they had, again, was downsizing. In the regulatory business, this is now huge. Succession planning represents one of the biggest issues for people. It does in every business. And retirement. Again, you can argue it's the same thing, but there is a different psychological barrier to be gone through with that versus that. And the last one, and this is where the government, we're involved with the government. For those of you who wonder whether knowledge management is here to stay, knowledge and information management has now become one of the 22 professions of government in this country. So what the government is trying to do is to equip people across the civil service with the capacity to go and say move from the Ministry of Justice, to move to DEFRA, to move to HMRC, if they know enough about a particular industry. So part of the challenge is to build and upskill people for flexible working. But obviously that means they need to transfer their knowledge when they go. The other issue, of course, is declining headcount. So these are the drivers that people are facing and why they're probably thinking about doing it. And here's a direct quote from the NHS. How can current NHS organisations mitigate against corporate memory loss as they work towards closure? And how will continuing successful organisations acquire knowledge from their predecessors? And here's a quick quote from somebody. We're about to lose some clinical staff from the programme. He's concerned we will also be losing a lot of knowledge and experience from the programme. So they addressed it as a specific issue. And our contention is this, that effective knowledge retention starts when someone walks in the door. I'm going to show you how that works in practice in a minute. It continues throughout their tenure when they're involved in projects, have to make decisions, handle difficult situations, they engage with stakeholders and they develop policy. Now if you think about that, that's almost the employee life cycle, because by the end, it's beyond when they leave to become part of the alumni network. Why is that important? For the simple reason that, here's a true anecdote. A friend of mine used to head the knowledge function for Cadbury Schweppes globally. And he noticed that they were losing their competitive edge. He asked a question which was really insightful. He said, he asked it of lots of trusted people who were in senior positions and junior positions. He said, who knows anything about chocolate? Who do you go to find out about chocolate? The answer he found was, of the 50 people that came up, 40 of them no longer work for the company. So his problem was he'd lost the ability to go and consult. He had to get back at those networks. So my contention is, to do that, you need to maintain networks.
So, Dan, do we have everything we need for this meeting?
It's all right here, sir. Is your data backup as reliable as it should be?
Don't worry, sir. He told me everything.
Ours is BrightStore storage software from computer.
Okay, that's slightly whimsical, but in a way, it's one of the biggest challenges. And you imagine that when someone walks out the door, if it's not just the way they save things, it's the way they think about things, it's the networks that they take with them, as I said. Does anybody know where that is? Correct. Very good. I'm fascinated, not just because my wife's Portuguese and we have a place near there, it's also because this was almost one of the earliest examples of knowledge management there is, and good knowledge transfer. The Portuguese explorers were amazing people. Henry the Navigator was one of the early instigators of something called the Sagres School of Navigation. Sagres is a little fishing village on the southwest of Portugal. It's the furthest most point on the Atlantic, and it's the place from which people used to set out when they went on voyages. The relevance of that is that in about 1484 he set up this school of navigation where people went before they went to voyages, and he got people together who actually knew something about the waters they were going to. And they had what we call today in knowledge management terms peer assists. He got people together, they exchanged knowledge, they talked about what was going on. 5 years later when they came back, one of the things they found, which was really interesting, was that people then came back and shared what they'd experienced. They kept charts on the way. That was the Academy of Navigation, the School of Navigation. It's worth a visit if you ever go to Portugal, but it's still there. And what's interesting is the principles that were going then are exactly the same as you have today in any business. We all, in England, we're still sort of basking in the afterglow of the Olympics. And one of the symbols for me of knowledge transfer, you wouldn't think the Olympics is the best example of knowledge exchange in the world. I would possibly contend it is, because if you imagine the torch as a metaphor, what actually happens is the Olympic movement take the torch and they hand it over to the next city, the next host city. Hands up, how many, give me a number, how many processes do you think, examples of knowledge exchange, do they go through? Wild guess. There are 12. I won't go through all of them, other than to say this process has been going on for Brazil since Brazil were awarded the Games. And what actually happens there are visits, there is a shadow team, there are 39, I think, training manuals, which are updated by one city for the host city. There are shadow visits. The Russians, who I think are hosting the Winter Olympics, have had 5,000 people in the UK for the whole period of time, just shadowing and understanding. And what happens they write knowledge papers of about 10 pages, which are handed over to the new host city. The other thing they do, which just shows it's not about codifying it on paper, they all make videos. They give people little video cameras. So when they're constructing things or they're doing something that's quite different, they take a video camera out with it. So there are video diaries as well. So the whole nuclear movement actually transfers the knowledge from one games to the next. I'm quoting, you heard a number of quotes. I'm using this purely because people revere the World Bank. I know them quite well, but it's not the reason. That is an interesting definition because for us it talks to the idea that knowledge is about insight for decision making. And its characteristics are unique. It doesn't depreciate with use, it's intangible. It is difficult to measure, but it requires continuous feedback to ensure relevance, influence and use. And here's the thing, it's difficult to codify, it's tacit, but it's at the core of social interaction. I would agree totally with Dr. Peter that the iceberg is a good analogy and that 2/3 of what an organisation knows is probably under the waterline. I don't want to drown you in using the same water analogy. I don't want to drown you in science, but all I would say is any assessment and in any knowledge program has these sort of component parts. What I'm focusing on really here is about diagnosis and strategy, and I think Dr. Peter was doing the same thing. The one thing that I didn't hear at the end, which I think is key, are these aspects of it, which are measurement and evaluation. For you used the word in your conference about sustainability. If you don't do these, you don't get a sustainable knowledge management initiative, in my view. This is too complicated to spend time on, other than to say this is at the backbone of the sort of questions and the sort of methodology that someone would be asking if they were trying to assess whether an organisation, how good an organisation was at about to do knowledge management, or identifying what critical knowledge actually is in the business. It's based upon the MAKE survey, it's based upon what the nuclear industry does, and it's based upon work that we've done in the Caribbean and indeed in Asia. Measurements. Very, very quickly, because I know there's time issues, this, and you'll see it when I hand the slides out, so don't worry, you can't read it, it's deliberate. What that is a way of assessing whether knowledge is critical or not in a business. Can we afford to lose it, or can we not afford to lose it? So there are a set of questions and a set of scores that the NHS now apply when they're trying to decide whether they should follow someone's career when they're leaving or not. So there are people who will actually go through that process. The nuclear industry is much more scientific. What it does is say, okay, there are different types of knowledge that are really valuable to us as a business. And it's codified. This is the explicit knowledge. It's put in certain places. And we have mechanisms. We talked about communities of practice. We talked about peer networks. It has ways of sharing those into lessons learned. But also, there is a big issue about knowledge loss. Now, if somebody walks out who actually is the only person who knows how to do a particular technique, then there is a problem. So this is where they start to think about, do they have cover? And they will, as I'm going to show you, what they will do is start to measure the individual risk. And they will maintain it. So what's the effort to retain the knowledge? And I'll show you a graph in a minute just to illustrate that. But there is a hugely scientific process, and what they don't want is to get too many of these critical and unique situations. The way they work is they share each profession, dare I call it that, each expertise within the nuclear industry, and they put somebody as the head of that. And they give them ownership and responsibility for trying to manage people's talent. So they have a talent management program, if you like, and they assess individually what the scores are. I'll show you in a minute their process for, once they've decided that somebody is really key and they can't afford, if they go, that they need to understand what they know, how they manage to capture that. It looks lovely in this colour, but what I wanted to just illustrate was they would end up with something like this. A graph that, a little favoured by many consultants, a 4-quadrant diagram here, where you actually decide whether, going back to what I just showed you, the critical risk of something leaving, it might be high risk, but actually it's not going to cost you much to collect it. But it might be that it's just a couple of interviews which you capture, you might do a video thing, but it might be that actually one of the people is so important that it's high risk, but it's high capture cost. So what they might do is have like a lunchtime session or an audience where they get a lot of people together and encourage them to understand what's going on and what this guy's taking with him. And just a couple more slides before I finish. What I tried to do here is to illustrate to you that as you go through, if you think about mapping the capture process to the employee lifespan, so that you're thinking about at the beginning what knowledge somebody's bringing into the organisation, you can actually start to prepare. And here are some of the ways, as they go through their organisation, that you can capture what they actually do know and what they're willing to share. That's an example from the health industry. This, where they talk about learning after, this is where they've spent their time in terms of capturing the downsizing. So they spend time on what they call it knowledge harvesting. You'll find there are all sorts of phrases that emerge. But they've accepted the fact as well, there is this thing called knowledge assets in a business. And identifying the knowledge assets are hugely important to any business if you're going to stay in business. The nuclear industry, as I said, does it by creating a special website of all of the critical knowledge. They call it the ROC program, but it's a very clever way of just actually saying, stand up and listen, this is important. This is actually the sort of knowledge that is critical for us to stay in business. And finally, we were talking earlier on in one of the coffee breaks. This is from an actual example. A friend of mine used to run one of the accountancy practices in Canada. And he was responsible for an onboarding process, the process by which you bring new hires on board. And he said there were two things stuck out in his mind when he first went there. Firstly, he was a senior man joining the organisation. His first problem was he was given a telephone and he didn't know how to work it. And it took him 2 weeks to find out because it was so complicated, and he said there was no way of knowing. Trite, but actually it proved to be an impediment for him doing business. One of the senior team, who was not from the accounting industry, turned up, and she found it impossible to go to meetings and not feel an idiot because she didn't actually know the jargon that was being used. She couldn't get up to speed. So what they created was like a Wikipedia, a glossary of terms within that organisation, which they developed into an app. So it was a little mobile phone app, and she took that to all meetings. Now the difference for her was significant. She came back to him and she said, you made the process of onboarding so much simpler. I apologise, I went through that at far too quick a pace, but I'm going to be here for the rest of the day if you want to expand on anything. Thank you.
Thank you.